So we are starting a new sermon series today that's called Authentic Leadership and Character. The word authentic has been defined this way: being true to your own personality, values, and spirit, regardless of the pressure that you are under to act otherwise. So we're going to look at two very short pastoral epistles in the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Paul was a mentor to Timothy in the faith, as I was telling our children this morning. Timothy became the pastor at the church in Ephesus, and he struggled with lots of different things as he was leading, as he was teaching, as he was preaching. And so Paul wrote these short letters to encourage him, to say, you've got this. Here's some things you should do. Here's some things you should think about. And so some of what he gets into is he talks about false teaching. He says, beware of false teaching. He tells Timothy about how his life, Paul's life, was once completely transformed. And he went from being one of the greatest persecutors of the early church to becoming the greatest advocate that we've ever known of the gospel. And so he says in J. Read, I am grateful to Christ who has strengthened me because he judged me faithful and appointed me to his service. Even though I was formerly a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a man of violence. So you see, Paul's life was completely changed, transformed. We forget that. We think of Paul as being the great advocate for Christianity, planting all the churches, traveling over the ancient world. But remember, Paul was a persecutor of the church until his Damascus Road experience, when he was changed, he was turned. In these letters, he talks about prayer, he talks about worship. He gives qualifications of bishops, deacons, ministers. And then we find that famous verse in chapter 4 where Paul says this to Timothy: let no one despise your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Paul did not want the fact that Timothy was young to be a reason why he couldn't lead. So he mentored him, he encouraged him, he helped him, and he said, do not let the fact that you are young be a reason that you don't set a good example in faith, in love, and in good works. What we find in these short epistles, and like always, I encourage you to read them because I can't get to every part of both of these, but we find clear instructions for what it means to be a Christian leader, to lead like Christ. But leading like Christ is not easy. Never has been. In his great book, With Love and Prayers, Tony Jarvis, a former headmaster, talks about leadership. And he says, whatever power a leader has is overshadowed by the second guessing and criticism that he receives for the decisions that he makes. Leadership does not confer happiness. He goes on to say, at the heart of all leadership at any age is character. The courage to cling tenaciously to a vision and the grit to exhaust yourself in helping others share that vision, and the toughness to endure the blame for every difficulty along the way. In my time as a minister, my time in teaching, I have found these words of Tony Jarvis to be very, very true. John Maxwell is another person that I admire as a leader. He was a pastor, still is a pastor, but he became a renowned expert on leadership. And one of the books that I'm recommending to go with this series is John Maxwell's book, The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. He also has one that's The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership found in the Bible. Either one of those are great. But here's what he says. He says, everything rises and falls on leadership. The people determine the potential of the organization. Relationships determine the morale of the organization. Structure determines the size of the organization. Vision determines the direction of the organization. But leadership determines the success of the organization. So in this new series, we're going to focus on a number of different questions. Here are a few of them. What is leadership? Why does it matter? What is character and how is it formed in life? What does it mean to be authentic in life and true to yourself? What does it mean to tell the truth and to build up trust? What does it mean to have integrity and humility? What does it mean to grow and to keep developing every step of the way? I don't have to tell you this morning that our world needs good leaders. Our world needs Christian leaders who care about other people and their well-being. Our world needs people who are selfless and not self-centered. This is true in the church. This is true in business, in schools, in government, and everywhere else. A number of years ago on a Sunday afternoon, I can't even remember exactly what I was preaching on, but I got a phone call from somebody in our church. This person had been in the church that morning. He'd heard the message. I don't remember the topic, but I do remember that I was talking about how loneliness has become a problem in our culture. This epidemic of loneliness. Even in the digital age, people are feeling lonely. And so this person was older. He had been very successful in business. He'd made a lot of money. He owned many things, but he called me on Sunday afternoon and he said this. He said, I've accomplished a lot in my life. I've lived in different parts of the world. I've owned many businesses. I've done lots of things. But now that I'm reaching the final stage of my life, I realize that I am lonely. I feel like I'm all by myself. And sometimes I wonder if the people in my life really love me, or do they simply love the life that I can provide for them? And he was wrestling with that, and we talked about that. Lots of people ask those questions later in life. I think Jesus was the greatest leader of all time. His earthly ministry only spanned about 3 years. We find that in the Gospels, but it changed the world forever. He was a revolutionary leader. In Matthew's Gospel, he says, if any want to become my followers, they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. And then he says this, what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what can they give in return for their life? What a powerful question. You might remember a book written 10 or 11 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, by David Brooks that was called The Road to Character. In fact, it's good to see Brad and Minajoya here this morning. They're the grandparents on the Leonard side. But Braden actually taught a class at MBA for a little while that was based on the model that Brooks sets forth in this book. And you hear me quote from David often because he has some really good writings. But in that book, The Road to Character, what Brooks says is he says there's two kinds of virtues in life. He says there's resume virtues and there's eulogy virtues. Resume virtues are the skills that we bring to the marketplace, the things that we learn in school, the things that help us get jobs and progress in our careers. Resume virtues are important in terms of upward mobility and economic opportunity. And so he says that resume virtues drive what he calls the Adam 1 part of our nature. Then he says there's eulogy virtues. Eulogy virtues are the things that preachers or rabbis talk about at your funeral. And these are not necessarily dependent upon resume virtues. It's whether you're kind, loving, devoted to your family, compassionate, a person of character. Are you a good wife or a good husband, a good father or mother? And so Brooks says this is what drives the Adam 2 part of our nature. Adam 1, he says, is the resume Adam that wants to build, create, produce, and discover. Adam 1 wants to have high status and win victories. Adam 1 feeds our pride and our ego. Adam 1 is what makes us competitive. But Adam 2 wants to have a serene inner character, a quiet but solid sense of right versus wrong. Not only to do good, but to be good. Adam 2 wants to love intimately, to sacrifice self in service to others, to live in obedience of some kind of transcendent truth, to have a cohesive inner soul that honors creation and one's own possibilities. Adam, too, is grounded in humility. We are not the center of the universe. We exist to love and to serve and to make things better. And if we're not careful, pride and ego will keep us focused all the time on Adam 1, on the resume virtues. So the goal for us, basically, is to build a life where we find the balance. We find the balance between doing our resume virtues well and doing our eulogy virtues well. It's not one or the other, it's actually a balance of both. But the question that I want to pose this morning in light of that model, because I think that's a pretty good model, is what does it mean to live and to lead with character? What does that look like? How would you answer the question? What does it look like to live and to lead your life with character? I'll share a few thoughts with you this morning. The first one is this: we lead with character as Christians by becoming more Christ-like. I asked the staff this week in our meeting, I said, what were some of the qualities of Jesus? And here's what was said. He was humble. He loved all people. He was honest. And he spoke the truth. He was disciplined, patient, obedient. He was full of the Spirit, and he went away often to pray and to be alone with God. He knew how important it was to fill his own cup so that he had something to pour out. He was a servant leader. He didn't just tell people what they wanted to hear or what he thought they should hear. He modeled it. He lived it. He washed their feet, remember? The disciples. Jesus rarely got rattled or angry. He was always able to maintain his sense of calm. Fear and anxiety never really got the best of him. He didn't become overwhelmed. So to lead with character as Christians, we have to become more like Jesus. We have to treat others with respect and empathy. We have to listen so that others know that we care. Jesus was confident, but he wasn't arrogant. He didn't let his ego get in the way. He knew his mission. He remained faithful to it. You know, we are not Jesus, but we're called to emulate him, to listen and learn from him. We will fall short. We will mess up, but we have to keep trying. We can't give up. We recognize that life and leadership is a journey, but it's full of surprises. But we always press forward, keeping our eyes on Christ. Secondly, this morning, to lead with character means that we have to know our values and our priorities. You know, so many things in this world clamor for our time and for our attention, right? And if you don't know your values, then you will focus on the wrong thing. Our values should actually be pretty clear. Faith, family, friendships. Yes, your work or your career is important. Service to others. But we live in a world that is all about power and money, and so many times that just becomes the name of the game. That becomes the driving force. That becomes the idol. Remember Fred Craddock's story? I've told it to you over the years. Fred was so creative, but he talks about having a conversation with the greyhound, the racing dog. He says, "Are you still racing any?" No, I don't race anymore. "Do you miss the glitter and glitz of the track?" No, the dog said. "Well, what's the matter? Did you get old?" "No, I still had some race left in me." "Did you get hurt? You couldn't win?" "No, I could win. I won a bunch of money." "What was it? Bad treatment?" "Oh, no, they treated us royally when we were racing." And Fred said, "Then what? Were you crippled?" "No, still pretty healthy." "What?" The dog said, "Well, I quit." "You quit?" "Yeah, that's what I said. I quit." "Why'd you quit?" And the dog replied, "I discovered that after all those years of running around the track over and over again, I was chasing a fake rabbit. And so I quit. All the running, and what I was chasing wasn't even real." You know, if we're not careful, we can spend most of our lives chasing a fake rabbit, thinking that it's real, but it's not. And remember, there's a difference between knowing your priorities and actually living them. Many people can name their priorities, but when you look at their calendar, you look at their resources, they don't align. It takes effort, it takes focus, it takes saying no to things that are less important. You remember that children's sermon? You know, I try to do the children's sermon every now and then. It can be hard to come up with that, by the way, I just want to say. But about the big jar, and you got the big rocks and the small rocks, and how if you have to get them all in the jar, if you put the small rocks in first, and then you try to stack the big rocks on top, it's going to stick out the top. There's not room for it. But if you get the big rocks and you put those in the jar first, and then you pour the small rocks, there's plenty of room for everything. Get the big rocks right. Put those in first. Everything else will adjust accordingly. Third, to lead with character means that you have to be humble and you have to embrace your shortcomings. We all have them, by the way. Blind spots, things we don't do well. Jesus gives us a parable in Luke 18. He says, there were two men, a Pharisee and a tax collector. They both went up to the temple to pray. And so the first guy, the Pharisee, stood by himself and he said, God, I thank you that I'm not like these other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. This guy was telling God how great he was, right? But the tax collector stood far off. He wouldn't even look up to heaven. He was beating his chest saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. There's a big difference between being humble and being self-righteous. Humility makes us stronger. Nobody wants to be around somebody who's self-righteous, who thinks they are God's gift to the world. Humility means that we keep our ego in check. Humility means that we recognize when we screw up and we're not afraid to apologize for it. That's a sign of strength. At the end of the book, The Road to Character that I mentioned, Brooks offers what he calls the humility code. It's worth reading, but he says this. He says, we have to understand that we are flawed creatures. We have an innate tendency towards selfishness and overconfidence. We have a tendency to see ourselves as the center of the universe, as if everything revolves around us. But humility is awareness that you are an underdog in the struggle against your own weakness. But you have to fight it, and you have to try to do better. Lastly today, to lead with character means that we seek to embody and live what Paul calls the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians. What are they? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's the scoreboard of how we're doing. In writing to Timothy, Paul is very honest about the way that he was before his conversion. He said, I was a blasphemer, a persecutor, a man of violence, but I received mercy because I acted ignorantly in unbelief, and the grace of our Lord overflowed for me with the faith and the love that are in Christ Jesus. You see, God can change hearts. God is in the business of changing hearts. Thank goodness. And God does change hearts. And when he does, it leads us to act differently, and the fruits of the Spirit are the signs. But the spiritual life takes work and discipline. It doesn't just happen. Moral formation is really important in life, and I worry that we don't have moral formation in our schools, in our colleges, to the degree that we need. It takes work. What's moral formation? Helping people learn how to restrain their selfishness to care for others. Helping people find mission and purpose in their lives. We try to do that as a church. Teaching the basic social and emotional skills so that you can be kind and considerate to others. There's an answer for you. Leading with character is all about doing those things. And as Christians, Jesus is our guide. It's not about being cruel. It's not about making the most money and having the most power, even though there's nothing wrong with making money. That's not the ultimate goal. In a world of selfishness and competition, Christ shows us the way. But I'm telling you, we need more people in our culture who are up for this challenge and who take it seriously and don't treat it as an afterthought. We try, we mess up. We're forgiven, we receive grace. But we have to keep trying. We have to keep trying. Amen.